Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back. We are going to be introducing the next panel on stage for a panel that is called Reimagining Racial Justice in Computer Science Education. And I am happy to help introduce this panel. Dr. Allison Scott, who is the CEO of the Kapor Center, Frieda McAlear, who is the Senior Research Associate for the Kapor Center, and Dr. Aman Yadav, Professor at Michigan State University. I'm speaking for myself, but I'm just super excited to have them here with us today. Brian, any comments, words about this particular panel?
Oh no, this is a rock star panel, and I don't think I need to say too much more. I want to get to it. So,
all right. So we're going to bring them back. We're going to bring them on stage, and I hope you all enjoy this panel. Please post your comments and questions in the chat, and we hope you enjoy this session. Thank you. All right, bringing you on, Frieda, and we're waiting for Aman.
Looks like we're just waiting for Dr. Aman to join us. Is that right? Okay, we'll give it maybe one more minute. Perfect. Welcome, Aman. Welcome, Frieda.
Hello, everyone.
Good morning, everyone.
So welcome, good morning, good afternoon. I'm Allison Scott, and I'm honored to be joined today by my stellar colleagues, Frieda McAlear and Aman Yadav, who have been critical partners with myself and colleagues in a recent push, as we're describing it, to move beyond broadening participation and towards a new vision for racial justice in computing. So huge thank you to Lynn Diaz and Brian Cox and the team for the invitation to present to you all today. And we would also like to start off by just saying thank you to each of you for the important work that you're doing to advance equity in CS education. Next slide, please. So again, my name is Allison Scott. Oh, sorry. Back one. My name is Allison Scott, CEO of the Kapor Center. I'll let Aman introduce himself.
Hello.
And Frieda McAlear.
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Great to be here with you.
Wonderful. Next slide.
So, Ublasakun, Nakaksakalunga Kaimruten. I just greeted everyone in my native language, Inupiaq. I'm from the Northwestern Territories of Alaska originally, and I just welcomed you to start this panel presentation in a good way by honoring and thanking the elders and ancestors of the lands that we're currently on. Both Allison and I are on the lands of the Chochenyo and Lashana territories here in Huichin, the village site of Huichin, or known today as Oakland. So we want to start in a good way by acknowledging the land under the erasure of colonization. This is something that we started in all of our Kapor Center presentations. We invite you, if you would like to put your the tribal territories that you're on in the chat as a way of greeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frieda, for the land acknowledgement and starting us off today. So quick agenda for our discussion today. We believe this is a really pivotal moment in time to think about racial justice in computer science education. So I'll start off by giving a few remarks just about technology and the role in our economy, and then going into what the current landscape around CS in Georgia looks like. And we are making the argument that, again, computer science and technology are kind of critical core in the fight for racial justice. And then I'm going to pass it to my colleague Aman to talk about racism in computing and specific ways that we might use computing as a strategy to address racial justice issues. And then Frieda will talk to us about her work in centering Native communities and get into more specific practices about how we might build culturally relevant and just computer science classrooms. Next slide, please. Okay, one more slide. So I always like to start these conversations off just by grounding us in the larger picture issues related to computer science and technology. So a couple key facts. So we know that technology is increasingly driving our economy. Next slide, please. And it plays a major role in Georgia's economy, employing about 370,000 folks in the tech sector. Next slide, please. Some of these probably are familiar to you all out in Georgia. So several major tech companies are headquartered in Atlanta, and more are opening campuses. So there is an increasing tech presence in the state of Georgia. Next slide, please. But we know from at least a decade of data that the tech sector is overwhelmingly white and male, and does not reflect the demographics of our increasingly diverse United States population. So about 8% of the workforce is Latinx, 7% is Black, and less than 1% are Black women. And these numbers are here where Frieda and I are in Silicon Valley. Those numbers are even smaller. So significant underrepresentation of communities of color in the tech sector. Next slide, please. And in Georgia, similarly, women, Black, and Latinx professionals are underrepresented in Georgia's technology economy. And so we know that the lack of diversity across the tech ecosystem is a systemic problem. We like to frame it, we like to use the framework of the LeakyTech Pipeline, where pre-K-12 education and computer science education in particular is a really critical place to address a much larger problem around diversity in tech more broadly. Next slide, please. So a couple more facts that we like to always center these conversations in are the fact that the technology sector is not only driving major portions of our overall economy, but is creating tremendous wealth. So tech wages are about 90% higher than the median national wage. And while we saw pretty significant hardships among folks in communities of color, specifically related to the COVID-19 pandemic and loss of employment, tech's top 7 companies added $3.4 trillion in value. So some sectors of the economy and some folks who are working in those sectors are doing extremely well, while others are being left behind. Next slide, please. And so we know that the homogeneity of tech and investment contributes to widening inequality. So in addition to things like income inequality, wealth inequality, we're also seeing things like displacement, homelessness, and then future trends around automation, which has really been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, destroying kind of, or getting rid of some of the lower wage, low skill jobs that are significantly going to affect communities of color. Next slide, please. And then at the same time, what we've seen a lot more attention on the issues that communities of color have been most impacted by technology products, and they're negatively impacted by technology products and their uses. So things like algorithmic bias leading to wrongful arrest, facial recognition software, and many different utilizations, and a number of other factors that that suggest that we need to have a more diverse workforce at the table in creating products and in making decisions about how these products are used. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the background context. So as we dig into what's happening in Georgia related to computer science education, next slide, please. So according to data from the Department of Education, thank you, shout out to you, Brian, 55% of public high schools in Georgia are currently teaching computer science. Here in California, that number is about 40, I think the latest is 42%. So Georgia is actually doing pretty well comparatively. Next slide, please. And we've seen a really significant enrollment since 2013 in middle and high school computer science enrollment. So a really nice, significant trend line in the number of students enrolled in computer science education across the state of Georgia. Next slide, please. And something that was really great to see was that the representation of students of color has actually increased by 26 percentage points to mirror overall enrollment. So the state of Georgia, across the state, is doing pretty well as it relates to racial diversity in computer science courses relative to the overall population. Next slide, please. But there are still equity gaps that persist. Next slide. So if we're looking at AP courses in particular, and we know that AP courses, there's a significant amount of evidence that AP courses are strong predictors of who goes on to major in computer science or computing related majors in post-secondary education. We know that Black, Latinx, Native American, and Pacific Islander students are significantly underrepresented. Next slide, please. And then girls are also underrepresented across all CS courses, comprising just 37% of the students taking computer science in Georgia. Next slide, please. And then, although it's just one indicator of performance or success, if we look at AP passage rates, Black students are far less likely to pass the AP computer science courses than their peers, suggesting much more attention needs to be paid to what's actually happening inside of computer science classrooms, how we're teaching the courses, how we're ensuring rigor, and how we're engaging all students to be successful. Next slide, please. So to conclude my portion of framing kind of the conversation, we are arguing that technology and computer science education more specifically is at the center of the fight for racial justice and equity. Next slide, please. And so this gives us an opportunity to reimagine, hence the title of our presentation, to reimagine CS education through a racial justice and equity lens, which we can do. There are 6 different suggestions that we have for what we can specifically begin to implement. So 1 is to use frameworks of racial equity. 2 is to address foundational education disparities. 3 is to think about culturally relevant and responsive computer science instruction. 4 is to invest in deep and ongoing educator preparation. 5 is to advocate for policies with intentionality around closing gaps. And then 6 is to center their perspectives and experiences of students. So as I conclude here with these suggestions for how we might reimagine CS education, my colleagues are going to talk in more specific detail about some of these opportunities that we have to create more equitable computer science classrooms. So I am thrilled to pass it on to my colleague, Aman Yadav, to talk more specifically about racism in computing and what we might do to address it.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Frieda. So Allison touched upon this. How do we think about racism in computing and the design of technologies? Can I get the next slide, please, Frieda? So we need to think about white supremacy, right? It's not just Ku Klux Klan or white nationalists marching with tiki torches, but white supremacy is a system of power and has long historical roots. So we need to think about how white supremacy is enacted through ongoing practices in our society, and in particular enacted through technologies to harm and oppress Black and brown communities. So while the segregationist law of Jim Crow era have been dismantled, the colorblind laws and practices still continue and perpetuate racialized inequities in the US. Examples of that include overrepresentation of Black and brown men in our prisons, right? Michelle Alexander called it the new Jim Crow. But like, what does technology have to do with white supremacy? Like when we design, or when technologies are designed and used to oppress people, especially Black and brown people, they maintain white supremacy. Next slide, please. So as we think about the role of technologies, what Rua Benjamin called the new Jim Code. So this colorblind racism plays out in the design of technologies in computer science education. this requires us to re-examine the basic assumptions about technology design, implementation, and computer science education, and the role computer science education plays in maintaining that, right? People often assume that technologies and algorithms are not biased, like the general people, right? So most of our community is aware of this, right? The books like Race After Technology from Rua Benjamin, the movie Coded Bias, right? But the technologies still continue to harm Black and brown people. So examples include like an oximeter that's inaccurate for darker skins, or Google face recognition photo service that organizes Black youth into folders called gorillas, right? So Rua Benjamin, if you haven't read the book, I'll highly recommend it, talks about how the racialized data and biases continue to inform the design of technologies, implementation of technologies, in what she called the new Jim Code, right? So what we need to think about next is, can you get the next slide, please? Is like, how do we address this, right? How do we address that our Black and brown students are successful in computer science and feel confident to pursue computer science? So they're passing the AP exams at the same rate as white and Asian peers, right? So we need a multi-pronged approach for equity-focused computer science education. So one aspect of that is broadening participation. And I think our community has been doing a good job of increasing access to computer science education, but we also need to think about what does quality computer science education look like, not just increasing access. And part of that involves bringing culturally responsive computing approaches into the classrooms that centers students' lived experiences and communities that they live in within computer science education. So Kapoor Center has been working on this equitable computer science framework that's going to be released later this week on Thursday, and it's next week here already, that actually talks about and provides concrete strategies for teachers to pursue and educators to pursue in their classrooms to center community experts in their classroom and students and families as designers of CS curriculum, right? And not what, I love this quote that Shasha Costanza-Chalk talks about, like we need to stop parachuting technologies into communities to solve problems. I think we can apply that to how we teach computer science as well. We need to stop parachuting computer science curriculum into communities just for the sake of, oh, we need more access to computer science. We need to think about how are we bringing anti-racist, justice-oriented, and culturally responsive computing into our K-12 classrooms. So the framework, you see a little bit.ly link there to attend the webinar for the release of the Equitable CS framework. It really includes actions for teachers to challenge colorblind racism and how it shows up in computer science education. So I hope you join us for the release of the framework. This was a community effort that includes teachers, curriculum developers, professional development experts, and computer science education research over the last year that have been involved in this effort. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Frieda.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk to you all a little bit today about the project that I'm co-leading called Expanding CS for Native Girls. But first, just a quick look at why we want to talk about Native communities in tech. So Native Americans are deeply underrepresented at all stages of the tech talent pipeline. Of course, we're about 2% of the US population and just 0.2% of APCSA test takers, or 0.3% of CS bachelor's earners, and 0.5% of the tech workforce are Native women. To this date, we don't have any data on the number of Native entrepreneurs or venture capitalists. So in order to address and tackle some of these disparities, my colleague, Dr. Kathy Derenwater from the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and I co-lead a project called Expanding CS for Native Girls. And our purpose is really to provide Native serving high schools with a sequence of 3 project-based, girl-focused, cultural revitalization CS courses that we're designing specifically to engage Native students and girls. I wanted to say a word about why we're using a cultural revitalization framework. Of course, This work draws upon the work of Black educators like Gloria Ladson Billings, Django Paris with cultural sustaining pedagogies. But cultural revitalization is really addressing the context that Native American students and communities are in today, where there's been, over the course of half a millennium of colonization, there's been such a deep erasure of Native traditions, traditional knowledges, life ways, food ways, languages, and values during the colonization and assimilation process. So the cultural revitalization CS curricula are meant to really provide back those traditional knowledges, the languages and values in a framework that supports tribal sovereignty, rematriation, and self-determination. And what this looks like for us in our project is we've adapted a cultural revitalization framework from the Department of Ed in South Dakota. They approved the Oceti Sakowin Essential Understanding some years ago, and we've adapted their the Lakota Oceti Sakowin Essential Understandings for our curricular framework. So we start with building on ideas of sovereignty and indigenous futures, connecting that with CS. Our next unit looks at lands and the environment. And then we move on to look at Native identity and resiliency, kinship and inclusion, oral tradition and storytelling, and traditional and electronic gaming. So this framework really helps us unpack ideas and values central to Native identities and cultures that are tribe specific, that are adapted to the tribes that we're working with in the Native schools that we're serving, in order to really give those students a very grounded curriculum in their culture, a sense for who they are at heart, especially for girls, and a way to connect those concepts of the traditional cultural knowledges and core concepts, foundational concepts in computer science. So I know that a lot of folks are educators. I wanted to give a couple of sample cultural revitalization lesson examples. So this is one that we developed for our introductory CS course. This is an animated animal story, which is essentially using the tribal knowledges of animals and the stories about them as a way to jumpstart a lesson in coding an LED matrix. So essentially, the students are sent off to learn about their own animal stories in their tribes. There's tons of these in most tribes, centering on particular animals and some of the behaviors they interact with humans or spirits or different creatures. And they get to take those animal stories and bring them to life in an animated LED and Arduino-enabled way. So usually students find this really engaging. They really like learning about their own stories. Again, these would have been passed down in a traditional context through oral histories and storytelling. However, now they're getting this in the context of CS coursework and foundational knowledge. Another sample lesson from the project that we might use is more girl-focused. So this is an activity where the students, again, using Arduinos and these LED matrices, these are 8x32 LED panels, where they can really learn about beadwork and the patterns of beadwork and translating those into the LED matrix using code. And so this is really a girl-focused cultural revitalization lesson, as traditionally in most tribes, of course, there's 574 recognized tribes, so this might not translate to all tribes, but in most tribes, beading and creating the ornamental aspects of regalia and clothing were a role given to girls and women in the tribe. Of course, this is not necessarily the case today. We have lots of beaders of all genders in our tribes, but this was a way to introduce, again, girls in a modern day context to the types of patterns that are specific to their tribe, that were used by their tribe. You know, this is a traditional Cherokee beadwork design here on the right. You know, these symbols might have meanings, traditional meanings to the tribe that, again, are explored through storytelling and through connecting with elders and beaders today. But again, this is an activity that connects a traditional and cultural knowledge and ties it to these coding and CS concepts. So this is, again, a way to kind of bring students back into their identity, so they're not giving that up while they're learning CS. This is something they explore more deeply and share with others. So in part of our project, and this is to Allison's point, Aman's point about how we center youth and youth leadership in our work. So this is part of youth liberation work that we're exploring in the next stages of our project, is really how can we co-develop decolonizing and liberatory CS education projects that center the experiences, insight, leadership, and initiative of Black and other Indigenous youth of color. How do we bring that to the fore in all that we're doing in education, in CS education in particular, and what structures and systems need to be changed or dismantled for youth to be able to create and express their dreams of freedom, remediation, and safety to thrive? So these are some of the questions that we have in our project and across many others at the Kapor Center, and we are definitely interested in hearing from you and what your projects are doing in terms of youth leadership development and exploring that inside of your classrooms. How do we lift up our youth and pour into them at the same time and create their self-determination through our work? Wanted to thank you for your time and attention today. We've had such a great time presenting to you, and we wanted to hear from you. So I know there's a Q&A session here that we can get started. Shall I stop sharing? Oh, this is also where the captioning is, so I'm going to keep sharing this slide.
Thank you so much, Frieda and Aman. And I would love to hear any reflections or questions that are coming up from the audience. And maybe just to kick us off, I'll ask each of you one quick question. So as we move kind of beyond these, like, what can seem at times to be theoretical ideas, can you give some insight, Aman, maybe from your experience working with teachers, and Frieda from your experience developing curriculum? Like, what are some very tangible things that teachers and educators and administrators can walk away with about how to move beyond just providing access to a course?
I think one of the things that we have heard from teachers is sometimes the curriculum that they have, such as the advanced placement curriculum, doesn't provide enough space to center communities and students' lived experiences into the classroom. And so in some of the interviews we did, the teacher's like, oh, I'll do it after the AP exam when we have 2 weeks left. I feel like one of the things we need to rethink is, how do we close this gap between the goals of the curriculum and centering the needs of the community? I think we need to support teachers to be able to provide that space that allows them to bring the culturally responsive aspects that, some of the things that Frieda mentioned into their classrooms, and not being beholden to, what the curriculum goals are. Because I feel like sometimes the goals of the computer science curriculum still centers the needs of the industry and capitalistic goals, and not necessarily, we're still parachuting a computer science curriculum into the community. So I think we need to stop doing that and leverage the expert. We need to think of community partners, parents, students, and teachers as designers of the curriculum, and not something that they just implement in their classrooms, right? And I think the framework provides these concrete strategies. So once we provide that space and educate teachers on what this looks like, I think that the framework has concrete actions that teachers could take in the classroom.
Thank you, Aman.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I second all of that. And there's also in our project this tension between, and this is something that we're really trying to explore even this summer, is how do we, again, bring in students into the curriculum development process in a way that is scaffolded, that's supported, and also honors and respects the boundaries of their time, where they have tons of other commitments to their families and communities. A lot of them are deeply involved in extracurriculars and over summer, even sports camps. And so we're trying to figure out the balance of, how we support their leadership and initiative and agency, and then also understand and recognize that they have so many other priorities in their young, very busy, scheduled lives. So that's something that we also wrestled. We're also in our team talking about ways, again, as Aman was saying, and as the framework says, to bring in other partners into the design process as well. So tribal advisory councils and working with elders on traditional knowledges and how that can be represented in the curriculum as well.
Wonderful, thank you. And one of the things that I would say I'm most excited about, which is articulated in the framework as one of the core practices, is kind of building off of the work of culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, and thinking about it empowering students to have a socio-political critique of computing and technology as part of the whole educational process, and not just like a nice to have or an add-on. So that's one of the things that I'm really excited about, and I think it will, based on the things that young people are telling us that they're most interested in and that they're most concerned about. I think this is a way to tie that back into, as Frieda said, interests and needs of students and communities. And Aman.
Yeah, I think one of the things that my colleague Michael Latchney and I, as work with teachers and our graduate students, Sukanya, we've been thinking about like that. We need to provide opportunities and spaces for teachers to go beyond the school walls and be in those community spaces, right? And bringing those community and cultural expertise into the classroom to inform their computer science teaching. So really the intersection of formal schooling with community to bring that authenticity in computer science classroom.
Absolutely, thank you. So there's a question in the chat from a participant that says, what are some effective ways to push back against the recent bad faith attacks on critical race theory and culturally responsive education? I know we've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about this, but wondering if either of you have any thoughts.
Well, let's first say culturally responsive theory, or CRT, is not being taught in K-12 classrooms, right? And even at the graduate level, if you're interested in CRT, then you go take classes. Nobody's forcing CRT on anybody. This is just a way to maintain white supremacy, right? They're just using that as a vehicle, right? So let's start there. And I think culturally responsive computing is about bringing students' lived experiences into the classroom, and that's relevant for all teachers, right? I think more broadly, I think an important issue we need to address is how computer science is maintaining white supremacy, right? And I think how do we bring that criticality in computer science? I don't think we have criticality in computer science, right? It's not happening at K-12 level. It's not happening at the undergraduate level, right? We're still driven by capitalistic goals of, I should say, those are still important. It's important to have representation of Black and Brown students in computer science and Black women in computer science. But we also need to start pushing criticality in computer science.
I really echo that. I think there's conflation of critical race theory and teaching history accurately. And I think that's something that we need to also emphasize in this work, that, we're not teaching, a legal framework developed by scholars, in the 80s and 90s that, again, is really important and vital at the post-secondary level, but really doesn't exist as CRT in K-12 education. And what we are doing in our project is really both looking at how families and students can really explore their own identities and histories inside of CS, but also accurately understanding the histories that they've been living through and that they already, to some degree, discuss and know. So in our case, our students are deeply aware that colonization, white supremacy exist. It's not that we're reinforcing that. They already know that this is happening by the time they're 4, 5, 6 years old. And it's really at the high school level, just trying to give them a framework and language to discuss that and affirm that that's been happening. That's not critical race theory. That's just history. So that's another sort of lens I like to talk to folks about in this case. But I think there's also an important challenge of not just talking to administrators about these issues, but policymakers really need to step up here. And I think that's something that the education community, I know that there are some policymakers who are already and coalition groups that are already mobilizing against this, as they should. This is really a region to region issue, and I think we're going to see it play out for a number of years ahead. But yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well, Allison.
I think you guys covered several of my thoughts already, and I think I'm really glad that this question was raised, because as we are exploring this equitable computer science framework that specifically calls out racism and how racism impacts education broadly and computer science education, I think we're keenly aware of what the pushback is on the other side, and I think one of the things that as a researcher that I always hold on to is like, how can we talk about knowledge and truth to the points that you guys are both making? And can we be more specific about what we're talking about? So what is the critique? Let's understand what the critique is, and then let's have a conversation about the critique, because we don't assume that, like, in a classroom or in a course that you might be teaching, 40 computer science teachers, that everyone has the same understanding of all of these concepts that we know are being taught in a bunch of different ways. So do we know what culturally responsive pedagogy is? What does it look like? What are the core tenets? Same thing with critical race theory. So I think there's a lot of just education that's needed. And I would hope that and I totally agree with Aman, I would hope that in the computer science education community that we can continue to push ourselves to be more critical and have a critical lens on topics of racism and equity. Okay, 2 more questions. One from Michelle Lee. What are some ways we can compensate community leaders, adults and students, for their time and expertise as we do this curriculum work? My district has a policy against paying them money and gift cards. Any thoughts? Frieda, I know you've spent a lot of time doing this deep work within community.
Yes, and we haven't run up against this yet. In the sense that we've been able to provide some form of actual compensation. But I understand that there are areas where that's not possible. And it's something that we've thought about in our team. And our first approach, of course, and I'm sure you've done and already thought of this, but would be to just ask the folks that you're inviting in to participate what kinds of compensation they would like to have. For some people, for students, for example, in some projects, there's a big reward for getting a tangible project, or, even a role or a named role in a project that they can put onto their, college applications or onto their CVs and resumes. So that's something that, that might be considered there. And a similar thing in a way might be applicable to adults. So there are multiple ways to think about compensation, but definitely asking participants what would be the most high value return sort of thing for them, I think would be the most relevant thing in that case.
Thanks, Frieda. Any other thoughts, Aman?
No, I think Frieda's got it covered.
Awesome. Okay, two more good questions here. One from Chuck Barlow. How can we use computational sustainability to address these issues with resilient and sustainable communities?
So I'm not familiar with computational sustainability, but my guess is, how can we use computation to sustain environmental and economic development in communities? That'd be my guess. I think, the way, not only to computational sustainability, the way I've thought about the role of computer science within communities is it's often used as a tool for talent extraction, right? To go and work for tech companies, but not often seen as a tool for wealth generation or sustainability, in this case, within the communities, right? So I think we need to, if we start centering the needs of the community and students' lived experiences in the classroom, I think we'll get towards that goal, and where computer science is used as a tool for wealth generation, as a tool for economic and environmental sustainability within communities where that computer science is taught, and not just to, putting profits over people.
I really echo that. And in our project, we've definitely been thinking about the role of CS and tech in these rural, often very isolated tribal communities as a way to sort of keep their youth engaged in their local tribal lands. So CS and tech jobs are often ones that they can do from, quote, from wherever. And this is a way that they can bring economic sustainability to their tribes without leaving and going to an urban center. So that's something that we've talked about in terms of tribal sustainability and the role that tech and CS skills can play in that.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think just one last question. Can the panel give a couple concrete examples of teaching criticality in K-12 CS?
I can, Frieda, do you want to take this one first and I'll jump in?
I mean, I think we would say some of the same things. Aman, I think you mentioned some of these resources. There's some stellar work out there, both in the documentary film space and books that have come out in recent years that have really been laying the foundation for educators in the space to really talk about some of these issues of race and technology. And to some degree, race, gender, and technology. And of course, that's the sweet spot for my project. And really, we couldn't do this work without that foundational work on intersectionality in tech and CS, the work on racism and white supremacy that so many Ruha Benjamin, Joy Bulamwini, which apologies if I've mispronounced your name, and so many others. And again, educators going back into the 80s and 90s, of course, have been talking about this for a long time. So, and researchers. So I think there's tons of work that we could cite. I think that's part of it. The conversational space is something that we're interested in facilitating in our project, not necessarily directing and leading. We want students to be able to find their own examples of inequities that are local and relevant to them, as Aman was saying, and really center their experiences of having different targeted ads in their social media browsing or their channels, understanding what role income is playing in the algorithms that are going to be present when their parents apply for loans or when they apply for different other economic programs and economic benefit programs. So there are things that, of course, that they need to investigate to a certain degree in order to understand the world that they're entering and that they're a part of, and how those impact generations of their community. So that's something that again, we want to facilitate, that we want to create the space for, that we want to help talk them through, but something that they also should be leading in terms of the discussion of how it impacts them directly.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with that. Like giving that space for students and to explore like how these algorithms are biased, right? So a concrete example of that is there's a tool by MIT Technology Review. I think it's the title of the article is "Can You Make AI Fairer Than a Judge?" Right? So it brings it makes how AI is biased and the sentencing software is biased against Black and brown people, right? And it's not really fair as to when the sentencing guidelines are being used based on that software. I think the algorithm that they were examining is called Compass. It's a risk assessment tool that is prevalent in the criminal legal system, right? So even showing students like 15-20 minutes to explore a tool that this technology is being used and sold as being fair, but look at the data using the simulation that you're just playing with of how it's biased towards Black and brown people. So I think it's important for students to explore that.
Excellent, thank you. I think we're at time. I think Lynn will tell us, but just wanted to thank Frieda and Aman again for wonderful contributions, conversations, and just for being thought partners and colleagues in this important work. And thank you all for your questions. Again, as Aman mentioned, we're really excited to launch the culturally responsive sustaining framework this Thursday that is going to go into much more detail about some of these core practices and how we might implement them in classrooms. So stay tuned there, and thank you all for joining us and engaging with us this morning.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Allison.